So our problem, very bluntly, is that we're governed by idiots. And the large part of our press is lying to you. That's what happened in COVID. That's why millions died. And that's why our economy and our society is suffering so badly from the impacts of climate change, and we're not being truly well informed about it.
But especially when it comes to climate change, it's about climate change journalists have to tell better, have to tell the stories better. There needs to be more of a storytelling angle to it. And you can't tell stories unless you know the fullness of what's going on. And you can't know the fullness of what's going on if you are not being given the resources to be able to do so.
I would say that today, climate is arguably our number one priority of coverage. Basically, kind of on par with stories like, the war in Ukraine and U.S. national politics.
It's almost like foreign desks are now involved with the climate beat a bit more.
Yeah,
so the fact that you have a climate beat back in the U.S.
We have an entire desk. I mean,
Exactly.
it's like, before it would only be like international news, national news, local news, sports, business,
and something
and
else
whatever.
separate.
But now, like, one of those is purely dedicated to climate.
I have incredible stories to tell you of my years trying to get environmental stories in. It isn't. I think the seniors, the ones with some level of influence inside the paper, needs to push for a desk, put it forward. The argument has to be put forward in terms of money. For them, papers also.
There's a friend of mine, she was a year senior to me in JNU, and just a couple of days ago we were talking and she said, don't you remember 20 years ago when I told you environment will be a big thing and you dismissed me and said I only wanted to study war? Well, and she mocks me about this really nastily, but it's deserved.
Mainstream media has the reach to whatever extent, but it does have that reach. So it has to plan, it has to future-proof itself. You have to be able to tell these stories, otherwise you're going to become irrelevant.
Sitting in Delhi or Bombay or whatever, telling stories of the people down there, and when Chennai runs out of water, then it becomes a story. But even then, not the poor neighborhoods. When Bangalore floods, it's the water above the Mercedes and the Porsches that get attention, not the poor neighborhoods that were getting either water at extortionate rates before and now are flooded. The people who have no insurance, the people who will always be at the receiving end and getting it in the neck, are rarely ever on our front pages, and they need to be.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Climate Change Corner of the Media Rumble. It's great to be here in real life after 2 years, and it's great to have so many perspectives on local and international climate reporting. So I would like to start by inviting all our guests to give their perspective on what is missing in climate reporting in Indian newsrooms. And do you agree that something is missing? I do feel I can only offer, an external perspective, and I've been always very impressed by how in-depth and well-researched climate reporting and environmental reporting is in India. So, I've been really interested in your perspective on what could be improved and what do you feel from an internal perspective.
Thank you very much, Lou. I'd like to thank my hosts, News Laundry, and the event management also for us to be sitting out here and discussing. I'm happy to see there's a lot of youngsters here. Okay, you were asking, first thing I'd like to say that we need to have a little bit of perspective. English language press is literally less than half of the kind of publications that are there now in India. The largest is Hindi. After that is English at about 50% less, and lesser than that is Malayalam and Urdu. So if you take it in perspective, I don't think there's much been done. In the English press, I find climate change gets reported in spurts. Before or after these climate conferences, there's always a jump. It's getting a bit better. It's not that it isn't, it's getting a bit better, but it deals more with what the administration is telling you policy-wise. I don't see much of actual field realities. If India has, which they keep saying and keep writing, that there are so many policy features for climate change and the environment, which I'll speak about later, I don't see anything that tells me about its implementation in the field. So I still think there is a long way to go.
So do you feel there's a difference between how climate change is covered in different languages in India?
I don't read all the other languages, but yes, I have been interacting with journalists from regional media, and I find, speaking from having conducted these awareness workshops with them as a journalist, I find their knowledge way more. They're much better. They just don't get the kind of visibility that the English language gets.
Right. And Omair, I know Third Pole has a really interesting audience pool because it speaks to international audiences, but it's also a multilingual platform. And so how do you think climate change coverage should be evolving? And, if you can identify where do you think there's room for improvement?
Okay, I'm just going to speak right now from the Indian perspective rather than the South Asian perspective, because that will get more muddled with each country that we cover having their own particular problems, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to Bhutan. But very simply, climate change, if you're going to simplify it a little too much, is a problem of water. And water is central to almost every activity that we have. It's central to power generation, whatever coal plants and any kind of power generation, you're always talking water. It's central to livelihood. It's central to social justice. We forget Ambedkar's first satyagraha was to the Malad water tank for access to public water. It's central to gender because by far, almost across the thing, 70% of tasks to do with water are put on women's shoulders. It's central to economic growth because, half of our economy is, or half of the people we employ are in the agriculture sector, and half of those are dependent purely on rains when it comes to water. It's dependent on infrastructure. We are a civilization that's for thousands of years completely dependent on monsoons, and in the last 50 years we've decided to build cities that flood every single monsoon. That is an incredible display of idiocy. But if we're going to ask the question, what's missing? What's primarily missing is joining these dots. And that requires a whole of governance and a whole of society approach. India has done this before. It did this to deal with food security. Our very low-cost space program is based on, in part of that. We've done this to make this country food secure, and that was a huge achievement, deeply inspirational. Even the whole system of democracy in a country that was very poor, barely literate, was a whole of the government, a whole of society approach. That is what's needed. And to give you an example of where this was needed recently was our response to the COVID crisis, where we failed incredibly. And yet, you will find that our government boasting that we did very well despite 4 million people dying. And I would suggest that the only time the Hindi papers actually managed to cover this properly was when Omair Ujala's people wrote in New York Times. That's not the press we need. What we need is actual telling the public what is happening, how the power works. So our problem, very bluntly, is that we're governed by idiots. And the large part of our press is lying to you. That's what happened in COVID. That's why millions died. And that's why our economy and our society is suffering so badly from the impacts of climate change, and we're not being truly well informed about it.
Bibek, what do you think?
Hello.
I mean, I have my opinion. I think, India has some real gems when it comes to climate change and, some real innovations. But
obviously, it's always a
So, thanks, Lou. So the thing is that what I would like to talk about is climate change reportage in India, especially in mainstream media. And in India, it's a case of apathy, really. There is no climate denialism in India, but there's a huge degree of climate apathy and ignorance. Now, I can't say which flows from which, but they both exist. Now, when it comes to reportage, you find most reportage around climate change happens when there is a big climate change impact. Say a cyclone hits, or there are violent monsoon rains, or there's a glacier burst flood, or something like that. So then it is there on the airwaves. It's on the front page of newspapers for a couple of days, and then it disappears. Even while it is there, as Omair was saying, the dots are never connected. You never really get to read or hear the entire story of what exactly is happening, why is it happening, what is exacerbating the damage of what is happening. And that is what is missing, and frankly. And the thing is, the only way that this can get better is when you have more dedicated reporters, journalists, and editors, and edit teams within mainstream media organizations which focus specifically on this. Because India is in a very, it's one of the few countries in the world where every different kind of climate impact that you can think of is going to affect India, whether it's heat, whether it's monsoon, whether it's the Himalayan glaciers melting, every which way. So it's extremely important that India does this, and Indian media does this soon.
it's always a matter of funding as well, no? Like finding
Sure, but
the
that,
new budget,
but then,
like
yeah, then,
business models.
But to begin with, this is what I think is
Yeah.
missing.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, definitely.
of course, I mean, ultimately it is funding, but before funding, there needs to be intent.
Yeah, it's like reshaping your business models.
You have to,
make,
because the thing is that, do you want to tell these stories, or do you want to be left behind?
yeah,
You have to, first you have to decide on that, because funding is not really that difficult to get if you have the intent for it.
yeah. Especially in this part of the world, I think there's growing interest in.
Certainly,
Yeah.
certainly, because, and if you need to tell, and just like most other kinds of, all kinds of journalism, all forms of journalism, but especially when it comes to climate change, it's about climate change journalists have to tell better, have to tell the stories better. There needs to be more of a storytelling angle to it. And you can't tell stories unless you know the fullness of what's going on. And you can't know the fullness of what's going on if you are not being given the resources to be able to do so. Whether it's training, whether it's funding for travel and reportage, whatever it may be.
We know that the Post now has recently opened or expanded its climate desk. Do you want to tell us a bit more about this, and what kind of stories, climate stories, would you want to see from this region?
Sure. So yeah, I'm not as familiar with the inner workings of the Indian outlets, but I can share a little bit about what I know my newspaper is doing. So we've, from what I can tell, we've expanded significantly in climate. Today, I should say this process probably began about 4 to 5 years ago. I would say that today climate is arguably our #1 priority of coverage, basically kind of on par with stories like the war in Ukraine and U.S. national politics. So the team now, they sort of created a separate team a couple of years ago. Today it's about probably like 30 to 40 people, which includes editors and what they call different sort of pods. And so at the top there are editors, and then of course there are sort of people who do videos, who do video editing, graphics, sort of dedicated data people, and then teams of reporters who cover. I think it's split into, for example, kind of accountability. So kind of how does certain flows of money or business interests or sort of, political influence shape decisions that have an impact on the global climate. Another team would cover something like, what is the impact on the ground, right? So major disasters, what you're talking about when there's a giant flood in Pakistan or a wildfire in Australia. Another team, I think they call it climate solutions. So, what are the new technologies that are emerging? Is it really feasible to, let's say, develop hydrogen technology or those types of kind of forward-looking things. And so it's been under the last editor and particularly under the current editor-in-chief, it's been pretty well, I think, drilled into our heads that this is a kind of a major priority from the staff. And so particularly, actually, I work on the foreign desk of the newspaper, so sort of we're kind of a parallel department to this climate coverage department that I'm describing. And so actually, this is just pure inside baseball, but even for us, we also are operating under the same mandate that this is a top priority. And so actually the challenge for us is how do we work together and sort of provide the resources, the reporting know-how here on the ground with this huge team back in headquarters who may know the science better, who are familiar with the newest scientific literature, the newest IPCC reports, the newest, what experts are talking about, what sort of are the new technologies coming out of the startup world, and how do we kind of, put that together to kind of, create interesting stories.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's like, it's almost like foreign desks are now involved with the climate beat a bit more.
Yeah,
so the fact that you have a climate beat back in the US.
We have an entire desk. I mean,
Exactly.
it's like, before it would only be like international news, national news, local news, sports, business.
And something
And
else.
whatever. But now, like, one of those is purely dedicated to climate.
Yeah, yeah. And do you guys find in India there is, or there's likely to be in the coming years, a growing awareness that climate change is a cross-sector issue that affects business, affects infrastructure, affects society in different ways? And so are we more likely to see a climate angle to everyday stories that are not necessarily tagged climate change?
I'm glad you brought that up, Lou. I was just going to develop Omair's argument. I think it's linked to the environment, which is why every single thing in India for us, because it's a matter of food security, it's a matter of water security, and we in India is in terrific distress water-wise. We're 54% water stressed. So all of these, soils, air, so environment for us is inevitable, the link. So to understand that, only then can you start writing about sports and writing about business, etc., because you see the link. So that is missing, and there are various reasons. The media has been changing hands in India in the last decade or so, let's say last 15 odd years, and interests are changing because of that. It's become commercial. The editor's role has diminished. I know of many cases where the editor can't even say yes to something if the proprietor says no. It's hurting his interests. So we've got stuff like that to deal with. It's not just a straight off answer. I'm very happy to hear what Gerry is lucky if he's sitting in a desk that has got all this. Doesn't seem to have any money problem either. Mind you, they've taken a long time to come to it. Not just they, I meant the US. But it's very happy to see that. For us to be able to do that, it also needs the editors to be aware, the gatekeepers to be aware, the chief subs, the news editors, and it needs for us, I think, in India to be made primarily into an economic story. Do it in whichever language you want, you will still be able to put it out. It can't be page 6 or something. It has to be political, economic, put it up in front. It has to become hard, what they call hard.
And there's something ties with what Bibek was saying, which is it's important that newsrooms themselves are equipped with a team that thinks that way. The way the Post has its climate team in DC and maybe connects with other beats and other desks that are not necessarily focused on climate only. But how important it is that newsroom slowly adopt and then start building climate teams as staff in order to be able to inject that climate perspective in, economic stories, business stories, environment, and other. Do you think that this would be what is needed? Or there are other ways to do it? With freelancers
It's
alone,
very
for example.
important. Right now, freelancers keep banging at the doors, and if you have people who are a little alert like Bibek is, then you'd get it in. But I can't see. I have incredible stories to tell you of my years trying to get environmental stories in. It isn't. I think the seniors, the ones with some level of influence inside the paper, needs to push for a desk, put it forward. The argument has to be put forward in terms of money for them papers also. So yes, it's very important. It's necessary, just like Gerry says, he's got all XYZ all in there. We also need.
Yeah. Omair, you were saying something. Sorry.
No. I mean, actually, just seconding Keya's point. I forget now exactly what year this was, but the Council for Energy, Environment and Water released a study with, I think, IIT. I'll have to come back to it, but this was a few years ago, and they estimated that just purely on climate disasters, Indian states were suffering a damage of $100 billion a year. Right? That's $100 billion a year. And this was a few years ago. I'll have to go back to that report. I need to actually talk to CEW again about this. But $100 billion a year. I'm asking you to imagine what that could do to our health infrastructure. I'm asking you to imagine what that could do for building roads, for actually allowing some people to live like normal, decent, dignified human beings. That's the kind of loss we're talking about. There's a friend of mine, she was a year senior to me in JNU, and just a couple of days ago we were talking, and she said, don't you remember 20 years ago when I told you environment will be a big thing and you dismissed me and said I only wanted to study war? Well, and she mocks me about this really nastily, but it's deserved. The thing is, I studied international politics. That's my background. That's why I, conflict prevention, terrorism, and everything else. None of these have as much impact on our living daily life today in India as Indians as climate change. And most of us are unaware of it. It also has a huge impact on our diplomatic and foreign standing. And it has a huge possibility for us when it comes to innovations. Because the world is changing. India is, as Bibek said, one of the few countries where we are impacted in every which way. How we adapt to it. So here's the opportunity in a crisis. The way we adapt to it is a possible beacon to how other countries can adapt. In the same way that our turnaround in managing our food security, or let's say even our, which has been undercut, but the Right to Information Act, we were able to influence not just the region, but the world by taking a leadership position in adapting. We can do that. India's greatest power is the power of its example. We are 1/6 of the world, or 1/5. I forget how many we are these days. It always changes. And we can do this, but we need to be thinking in that way.
So the thing is, I would like to talk about the media and the stories that we are telling, rather than on the governance and policy side of it, because that's a whole other discussion. When it comes to media and storytelling, it's interesting that Omair pointed out that CEW study. There was another CEW study which came out last year, which showed with like massive empirical data that 75% of India's districts are extremely, for a variety of reasons, are extremely climate vulnerable. Some due to heat, others due to sea level rise, others due to monsoon rain deficit places becoming flood-prone places, and vice versa, flood-prone places becoming rain deficit places. So it's there, it's a reality, it's not a future, it's a reality that we are living now. So when it comes to telling those stories, you have to take that into, you'd have to consider it. But forget that even, forget just that. Look at business and industry. Industry in India is changing already, and it will continue to change at an even faster rate as energy transitions happen, and that is going to happen. There's, to whatever extent it does happen, but it's going to be big enough that it is going to completely change the way that India does business, that Indian industries do business. Even if from that very point of view, if you as a mainstream media publication do not, you have to think on your feet. You have to change with the times. You cannot continue to tell the same kind of stories in the same kind of ways. You have to find new ways of telling new stories that are happening right now. And that is another part of climate change reporting that is very, very important, that it happens now. And I can speak about mainstream media because there's a lot of really good work happening in non-mainstream publications. But mainstream media has the reach to whatever extent, but it does have that reach. So it has to plan, it has to future-proof itself. You have to be able to tell these stories, otherwise you're going to become irrelevant. So yeah,
this is something that I wanted to ask you all, and it's a really good point. So how do we make climate change more accessible, the climate and the environment story, but they can be sometimes two different stories, requiring two different ways of telling the same story. How do we make all of this more accessible and involve more people that might not have an interest in the green economy or the green issues, or they might not have the tools, they might not have, gone to the same levels of education, or they might have other priorities and they feel like other things are more urgent. How do we reach those readers or viewers? What is needed? And I know that, for example, the Post is experimenting with various formats, Gerry was saying, with various strands of the climate reporting space, so solutions, accountability, and all of that. So what do you think is needed in India and achievable in the medium short term without, thinking?
If you put it that way, I think you need to change the story. Depends, this country, I'll just give you an instance. It's very cricket crazy. Make it a climate change story. You have to have the link. Turn it whichever way you want. If you're speaking of industry changing, show us how. Again, the reporter needs to have some kind of background to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's frustrating to read stories that leave you with the why and the what's all missing. So it's difficult that way, but it is possible. It is possible. There are so many who can actually turn around and change the story. So don't make it boring environment. And most, I'm sorry, but it's true, most English language press just deal with urban India, not even full urban India. To them, all these stories about stormwater drains, flooding, etc., don't affect them. They don't care whether there's drinking water going into their toilets and they're flushing that out. So the story has to change so that it affects them, is what I think. Let's ask these youngsters later.
On that point, basically, one thing our journalism generally suffers from is this, the fact that our newsrooms have gotten much smaller. And by design, what that means is that you have a lot of parachute journalism, helicopter journalism, right? Where somebody from Delhi is reporting on Guwahati. And the local reporter is reduced to a stringer or whatever. That's just really bad journalism, frankly. I'm maybe tooting our own horn because at the third pole we privilege people reporting from the region. But I think, okay, so journalism is basically about three things in a democratic system. It's about following the money, It's about revealing how power works, and it's about people, right? And I think one of the things that has been missing in trying to connect those dots is by letting people tell their own stories of hardship and change and innovation that is happening now. And the people of the region need to be front and center, whether it's an entrepreneur taking out a new innovation, whether it is a factory that's shutting down, whether it is a community that's forced to scrape through the muddied water coming out of a coal plant. These people need to be front and center of and we need to see them. We need to see our co-citizens, what they're dealing with. And we often do not. We often do not even regard them as our fellow citizens. Uh, I'll just give one very simple example. We had these rains in Delhi for the last 2-3 weeks that were crazy, right? But I would like you to imagine how many weddings were ruined by these rains, because people plan weddings at this time. India has a $50 to $150 billion wedding industry, right? We actually have no data because by general things, we have no data, and half of that money is black anyway, or maybe more than that. But it affects everybody, right? I mean, we now even have finally moving towards a few gay marriages. So it even affects a lot of people, even those who were formerly excluded. It affects every single family. We're all suffering in this. And we're all finding ways to do something different. But where are the faces of those people? Do you see them? Is that what comes to your mind when you think climate change? Why are we not making that connection? And that's largely because, unfortunately, we're sitting in Delhi or Bombay or whatever, telling stories of the people down there. And when Chennai runs out of water, then it becomes a story. But even then, not the poor neighborhoods. When Bangalore floods, it's the water above the Mercedes and the Porsches that get attention, not the poor neighborhoods that were getting either water at extortionate rates before and now are flooded. The people who have no insurance, the people who will always be at the receiving end and getting it in the neck, are rarely ever on our front pages, and they need to be.
So it makes you think the idea is very simple. It's just let's focus on the impacts on people and give voice to the people that don't have a voice right now.
I'm simplifying it too much.
Yeah.
As you know. You've
But-
done this so much. You can answer this question.
No, but like one thing that I always found, in my reporting, but also as a challenge to all newsrooms, is how we equip the staff and our freelancers to be able to tease out the climate link that is there when it's robust, and not shoehorn climate change everywhere just because maybe our editor likes the idea of doing climate change stories, so we look at the next rains and they're like, oh, climate change these days is really bad, and maybe just seasonal rain. And India is a country where you have lots of extremes, and even before climate change came in, you'd already had a lot of extremes every season. So this goes back to the original question: how do we equip our newsrooms to be able to do this in a robust manner that is fair and really identifies the victims of climate change and separates them from what happens in places where governance is not that great, and maybe the government is not paying attention to the people and not building up the right infrastructure and blaming it all on climate change. This happens everywhere in the world, but I imagine in India, yeah, Pakistan is one example. I mean, obviously, climate change has been proven to have played a part, but there's also a big governance problem. Like people from Pakistan were saying, infrastructure was really bad. Or this could have been, if not prevented, mitigated without killing so many people. So this is also a job for the media, I think, in part, to drive that narrative. And I don't know, what you think, Bibek, but also like from an external perspective, Gerry too.
Yeah, I guess there's good news and bad news when it comes to kind of public engagement. The good news is that there's been I have observed far more interest from readers about this issue in the last few years. I think the bad news is that is because these like catastrophic events have been happening, right? That you simply can't ignore. But it has been, I mean, in terms of what I have seen in terms of kind of reader public interest about what's happening in South Asia specifically. I mean, I think particularly earlier this year when we had the heat wave across northern India combined with the sort of the 1-2 punch with the flooding in Pakistan, that definitely was one of those moments where you felt like, people sort of were starting to get it. Our editors have generally been quite sort of aware of some of these issues, but you can just feel that it's in the conversation. People are understanding the significance of this is indeed a region where hundreds of millions of people will eventually struggle to survive under or work outside, right, under heat conditions. It's a place that will face worse and worse flooding. In the southern coastal areas. This is a place that also on the policy side is the world's third largest carbon emitter, and what India chooses to do also has significant global ramifications. And so I would just say that there is more attention paid, and obviously as an organization, we have also really stressed what the editors say should be sort of like visual first kind of reporting, because they think that maybe if the reader gets lost in some of the science, maybe there are other ways to kind of bring in their attention. And I think it has worked, but it comes at a huge cost in organizational resources. So for example, earlier this year, after the heat wave, we did a piece where we followed like 2 workers outside in Delhi. One was like a delivery guy, and another was a construction worker, and we sort of measured like the wet bulb globe temperature outside where they worked. We strapped them actually with heart rate monitors to see how their body kind of was dealing with the heat. We took like urine samples to measure their dehydration, and then sort of packaged the whole thing with video and photo. But it was extremely time consuming, and it was actually kind of shocking like how much time and money that something like that, which the end product wasn't particularly huge or even that impressive. I mean, I think it did sort of give the reader a sense of what it's like to work in some of these conditions, but just kind of seeing how much time had to be put into producing a piece like that, it's kind of and I guess the only upside that I can think of is that there are increasingly foundations around the world, I think, that are offering grants to news organizations, freelance journalists, to cover some of these issues, and hopefully that can help share some of the financial burdens of delivering that kind of engaging sort of visually engaging journalism that'll draw readers in.
So yeah, I think the issue of formats is very important going forward. I think we will need not only just different ways of telling stories and different contents for our stories, angles, but also formats. Yeah, and so you were saying.
So I'm actually quite optimistic in this regard, frankly, because in terms of climate change being a topic that media houses, journalists pursue, and this is where I want to draw briefly a distinction between environment reporting in India, which has a very long and rich history, and climate change reporting in India, which is in its nascent stages. So when it comes to climate change reporting per se as a thing, 2015 is a watershed year, not just because of the Paris Accord. Thereafter, it has continuously grown in becoming, climate change has grown as a subject that you report on. And we are in 2022, and I think it's only going to get better and better in terms of the kind of stories that we tell. And I'll just take a brief example because it's difficult for me to talk in generalizations, but when it comes to a story, ultimately your story is the only thing that is between you and the reader. So you have to be a good storyteller. Now, to be a good storyteller in climate change, you need to be trained to be a good storyteller. In order to be trained to be a good storyteller, you need to have the kind of institutional backing or grants or whatever which helps you do that. Again, the pool for grants or the journalists who get these grants is also very small. And you often find it's the same journalists who are getting these grants often enough, over and over again. So that's a separate story. So why I'm optimistic is that, like, I speak with climate scientists every other week, Indian climate scientists, policy people. For stories I've done field reportage in various places where I'm talking about. And the thing is that awareness is high, obviously scientists among, even when writing about the Uttarakhand floods, which happened last year in February, talking to a village sarpanch high up in the Uttarakhand Himalaya, he has the awareness of what's going on. He doesn't have the words, he doesn't know. I mean, there is no Hindi counterpart to climate change, but he knows what's going on. His villagers know what's going on. You have to be able to tell those stories, and telling a story is also an art. And I think that in that respect, Indian journalism has to get better. And how do you tell those stories? Where you bring it out, like what's actually happening, you say it as vividly as possible, without necessarily using the people that you're writing about as kind of like, guinea pigs to like tell your story. But you have to kind of, you have to be a good storyteller. And the thing is that newsrooms have to invest in journalists to become good storytellers. I think India used to have really good storytellers in journalism, mainstream journalism. That has generally declined because, most people are worried about having a job in the first place.
Financial
but I think
factors,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but that apart from all the other things that every one of us have been talking about, you have to be a good storyteller to bring out the reason why should you as the reader care about climate change or climate change stories. You have to do that. Yeah.
Hopefully there'll be time for a few questions. I would like to give precedence to younger people in the audience because I would have wanted to tackle the issue of how to, tap into new talent in journalism. So now is the time. If we have any young journalists that want to break into climate, in the climate beat, it'd be great to hear from you.
Hi. Yeah, hi. So, well, when I think it comes to combating the problem of climate change, we're far beyond the ambit of individualistic approaches and solutions. And it's high time that the government intervenes along with international collaboration. So, do you think that conventions like the Paris Convention and COP26, they are steps in the right direction or simply a far cry from reality in the sense that most of the onus it's put on the developing and the underdeveloped countries? So is it prudence, and what should be the future course of action?
Great question. Who wants to take it? Succinctly. Because this.
All of us would have something to say.
Yeah. I mean, you guys decide who's going to take it. Please keep it short because this could be a matter of another 3 hours just to answer the question. Yeah. Okay, Bibek, yeah.
So I think international fora like COP26, COP27, etc., the UNFCCC, three C's, yeah, the convention, it's a very important thing. It's very important that, even if you're disappointed at the end of COP26, you should still know that there is going to be a COP27 where hopefully things will get sorted out. Because you have to have hope, because if you don't, and also the other reason is that these fora are very important for countries to lay out their views. So for example, the less developed countries or the island states or, countries which haven't caused the climate crisis, but who are the most vulnerable to it, they need to have a fora in which to lay their demands. So for that reason itself, this is an important thing. And though it's difficult in this day and age to find kind of like unilateralism in the international space working, you still have to try for it. And so it is important, yeah.
Great. We have, I think, time for another question. Someone at the back.
Hi, somebody who's currently covering the climate beat as much as possible. So, just going from that question a little bit, it's mostly, the climate narrative currently is mostly influenced by the global north language, right? So even talking about some of what you all have spoken about, that there's a need in India specifically, A, to have an India lens, but B, also to have vernacular media being able to cover these topics as much as possible. So how do you see media moving it forward, right? Because that might be happening for English newsrooms, but vernacular media is still being left out a little bit. So, and that's to the panel general.
So I would say for climate change, we use Jalvayu Parivartan when it comes to Hindi, but that's not. That's a mouthful. And it doesn't, yeah. And I was actually interviewing somebody for this newsletter I write called Environment of India, Mehtab Alam, who was the Urdu editor at The Wire. And he wants to do a podcast looking at, he's now at the National Foundation of India, which is just around the corner. And wanted to talk about we need to develop a language for the Urdu media to talk about environmentalism and climate change because there is no connecting the dot. And it's a large Urdu media in India. Much of our translation, my social media colleague is there, which is why I keep looking that side. And so, unfortunately, when much of our Urdu work is largely for the Pakistani stories. And a lot of that comes back to this thing that they're often not equipped to get the science exactly right. And our job as editors has always been to try to inform and deepen, and also many times rejected and saying this has nothing to do with climate change. Please don't say that. It is coming along, but it has to be done in the way that Keya is talking about, that you connect it with the money, you connect it with the life that people are living. Only then does journalism have a life and make sense. And so when we talk about vernacular media, and I do not like to use that word, I think English is also a vernacular at the end of the day. So let's say in the non-English media, when you're talking about, I think there is a great scope for this, and I'll tell you why. All language is rooted in a geography. That geography is an outcome of particular ecosystems. And there are words that have meaning in particular languages that they do not have in other languages because they are rooted in that ground. And that ground is watered by the climate that we live in. And unless we are able to articulate that in the sympathy with the local ecosystems, in the language that is understood and is relevant to that ecosystem, you are talking, even if you're talking in the same, technically the same language, you're talking past the people. And that's why we need journalism from the ground around particular ecosystems are based and emerging from that language.
Can I just add a little to it? Yeah. I've had, since you speak of regional media, I've had regional language journalists coming to me and telling me that they don't get the opportunities that the English-speaking press gets, to attend wherever, COPs or whatever. I think personally that you all need to get leaderships within the regional language media to push for stuff like this. No one's going to hand it to you. If you're waiting and grumbling that it doesn't come our way, it won't come. So, you need to tell your editors that. If you bring this up, tell your editor that do something about it.
Thank you, Omair, Bibek, Keya, Gerry, and Lou for thinking out loud with us. We would also like to thank the US Embassy New Delhi for presenting this session.